Most battles that ruin a man's life never announce themselves. They don't knock loudly, they don't come wearing a warning label, and they don't look like an enemy at all. That's what makes them so dangerous. The enemy you don't see is the one doing the most damage. He doesn't rush in to destroy everything at once. He works slowly, patiently, almost politely, slipping into the cracks of your thoughts, your emotions, your daily routines. And before you realize what's happening, you're fighting everyone around you while the real enemy stands back and watches. FIELDS, think about how many times a man says, provides the I don't know WHATSWRONG with me counterbalance necessary for neutral atoms. Or I'm just tired. Or I've lost the fire I used to have. That's not always burnout. That's not always stress. Sometimes that's spiritual warfare doing its quiet work. The enemy knows if he can keep you distracted, emotionally numb, or spiritually sleepy, he doesn't need to knock you down. You'll slowly drift away from who you're called to be. This is where relationships often take the first hit. A man begins to feel distant, impatient, or irritated for no clear reason. He starts pulling back instead of leaning in. Conversations become shorter. Compassion gets thinner. And instead of recognizing the attack, he assumes the problem is the person next to him. He starts fighting the wrong battle with the wrong enemy. That's exactly how spiritual warfare wins ground, by staying invisible. The enemy loves confusion. If he can blur the line between what's emotional, what's relational, and what's spiritual, he can keep you reacting instead of discerning. You'll argue harder, withdraw deeper, and carry guilt you were never meant to carry. And all the while, you're blaming yourself or someone you love, unaware that something darker is at work beneath the surface. Notice how the enemy rarely starts with outright rebellion. He starts with small compromises, a little neglect of prayer, a little less discipline, a little more indulgence, a little less self-control. None of it feels catastrophic in the moment. But over time, those small cracks widen, and once the foundation weakens, everything above it becomes unstable. Your peace, your purpose, even your ability to love well. This is why awareness matters so much. A man who doesn't recognize spiritual warfare will always misdiagnose his struggles. He'll think his problem is motivation when it's actually opposition. He'll think his problem is anger when it's actually an attack on his identity. It's really a LASTING awareness of what's happening behind the scenes. The enemy thrives in secrecy. He loses power the moment he's exposed. When a man understands that not every battle is visible, he stops panicking when things feel off. He stops turning on himself. He stops lashing out at the people closest to him. Instead, he becomes alert. He starts asking better questions. He starts guarding his mind, his heart, and his spiritual life with intention. This isn't about fear, it's about clarity. The strongest men aren't the ones who never struggle. They're the ones who recognize when the struggle isn't natural. They understand that discipline, prayer, and truth aren't religious habits. They're defensive measures. They keep you awake in a world designed to lull you to sleep. When you finally see the enemy for who he is, you stop wasting energy fighting shadows and start standing firm in truth. Every serious battle is decided long before it ever shows up on the surface. And spiritual warfare is no different. The battlefield is not first your circumstances, your relationships, or even your behavior. The battlefield is your mind. If the enemy can influence what you think, he already has leverage over what you feel and eventually over what you do. That's why the battle always begins in your thoughts, quietly shaping perspectives, planting questions, and whispering lies that sound just reasonable enough to believe. Most men don't wake up and decide to drift away from purpose or integrity. It starts with a thought that lingers too long, a doubt about your worth, a question about whether obedience really matters, a comparison that tells you everyone else is doing better than you. Those thoughts don't feel dangerous at first. They feel personal, they feel logical, but left unchecked, they slowly build a narrative that pulls you away from truth and toward isolation. This is especially destructive in relationships. A single thought like, "she doesn't respect me," or "I deserve better," can replay in the mind until it hardens into belief. Once the mind accepts it, the heart follows, and the behavior soon reflects it. Distance grows, communication breaks down. And again, the enemy stays hidden while you fight the person you love or withdraw into silence. The enemy knows he doesn't have to overpower you, he just has to persuade you. He works by repetition, not force. He repeats the same lie until it sounds familiar, and familiarity feels like truth. That's why guarding your thoughts isn't optional. What you allow to stay in your mind will eventually take root in your heart, and what grows in the heart will shape the direction of your life. Notice how temptation often begins as imagination, a mental picture, a what-if scenario, a fantasy of escape, pleasure, or validation. The battle is already underway before any action takes place. By the time a man says, "I don't know how I got here," the mind has been traveling there for a long time. Spiritual warfare doesn't rush, it waits for the mind to surrender first. This is why emotional struggles often feel overwhelming. Anxiety, bitterness, lust, and discouragement don't usually arrive fully formed. They are built thought by thought. A man who doesn't learn to challenge what enters his mind will always feel like he's fighting from behind. But a man who learns to recognize when a thought doesn't align with truth begins to reclaim authority over his inner life. Winning this battle doesn't mean you never have negative thoughts. It means you don't let them settle in and make themselves at home. It means you question them instead of obeying them. You replace lies with truth. You interrupt destructive patterns before they become habits. This is where discipline becomes freedom, not restriction. Strong men aren't those who feel nothing. They're those who think clearly. They understand that clarity begins in the mind. When the mind is guarded, the heart becomes steadier. When the heart is steady, relationships grow stronger. And when relationships are healthy, purpose is easier to pursue. The enemy wants your mind because your mind directs your life, but once you take every thought seriously, you stop losing battles you didn't even know you were fighting. One of the most subtle traps in spiritual warfare is convincing a man that every struggle he faces is purely personal or relational. When things begin to fall apart, the first instinct is to look at the people closest to you and assume they are the problem. You think the tension in your home, the distance in your relationship, or the frustration in your spirit must be caused by something someone said or did. But not every struggle is a relationship problem. Some battles are spiritual attacks designed to wear you down and pull you apart. There are moments when a relationship hasn't changed, but your perception of it has. The affection is still there, the commitment is still present, yet something feels off. Irritation shows up without invitation. Patience runs thin. Small disagreements feel heavier than they should. That's often when the enemy steps in, amplifying emotions and distorting perspective, hoping you'll react instead of discern. The enemy understands that division is one of his most effective tools. If he can get you to turn on the people God placed in your life, he can weaken you without ever confronting you directly. So he nudges you toward blame. He whispers that you're misunderstood, unappreciated, or better off alone. And slowly, the bond that once felt secure begins to strain, not because love disappeared, but because awareness did. Many men carry silent battles they never name. They feel spiritually dry, emotionally disconnected, and mentally exhausted. Yet they assume the problem must be the relationship itself. So they withdraw, they shut down communication, they build walls instead of bridges. The tragedy is that the enemy doesn't have to destroy the relationship outright. He just has to convince you to stop fighting for it. Spiritual attacks often show up as exaggerated reactions. You respond more strongly than the situation calls for. Words cut deeper than they should. Disappointment lingers longer than necessary. These aren't signs of weakness, they're signs of pressure. Pressure that comes from an unseen source pushing on emotional wounds and unresolved stress. This is where discernment becomes critical. When you recognize that something more is happening, you pause instead of explode. You pray instead of accuse. You seek understanding instead of retreat. Discernment keeps you from sacrificing something valuable because of a battle you misunderstood. The enemy wants isolation because isolation makes a man vulnerable. When you feel alone, even in a room full of people, you become easier to influence. You start believing that no one understands you, that no one stands with you, that walking away is the only option. But that's a lie meant to separate you from the strength that comes through connection. Healthy relationships don't fail because of conflict, they fail because of unaddressed spiritual pressure. When a man learns to ask, "Is this really about us, or is something trying to come between us?" he changes the outcome. He stops feeding division and starts fighting the right enemy. Understanding this doesn't excuse unhealthy behavior or avoid responsibility. It simply gives clarity. It allows you to confront issues with wisdom instead of emotion, with patience instead of anger. And that clarity protects what matters most. When you stop treating spiritual attacks like personal betrayals, you gain the strength to stand your ground and preserve what the enemy hoped you would abandon. The enemy rarely attacks a man at his strongest point. He looks for the places that are already tender, the memories that still sting, the wounds that were never fully addressed. Pain from the past doesn't disappear just because time passes. If it's ignored, it waits, and the enemy is patient enough to wait for the right moment to use it. Every man carries a story of disappointment, rejection that cut deeper than expected, trust that was broken, love that didn't last, dreams that didn't turn out the way he hoped. These experiences shape us, but when they aren't healed, they become entry points. The enemy doesn't have to invent new pain. He simply reopens what was already there and convinces you that it defines you. This is why patterns repeat. A man wonders why he keeps ending up in the same kind of relationship, why the same arguments resurface, why he keeps sabotaging something good just as it starts to grow. It's not coincidence. Unresolved wounds influence present decisions. The enemy uses them like leverage, applying just enough pressure to steer you off course. Shame is one of his favorite tools. He takes past failures and whispers that you'll never be different, never whole, never worthy of something better. Over time, that shame shapes identity. A man begins to expect disappointment, so he unconsciously moves toward it. He settles for less, avoids commitment, or keeps emotional distance because it feels safer than hoping again. Emotional wounds also distort trust. When trust was broken once, it becomes harder to believe it can exist again. The enemy feeds that fear, turning caution into walls. A man tells himself he's being wise, but deep down, he's protecting pain rather than pursuing healing. And the enemy is content as long as you stay guarded and closed off. Healing requires honesty, and honesty requires courage. It means facing what hurt instead of pretending it didn't matter. It means acknowledging that strength doesn't come from suppressing emotion, but from surrendering it to truth. The enemy loses influence when wounds are brought into the light, because light exposes lies. This is also where community matters. Isolation magnifies pain, but connection dilutes it. When a man walks alone with his wounds, they feel heavier. When he allows trusted voices in, perspective returns. The enemy thrives in silence, but silence is broken by truth spoken out loud. Spiritual growth isn't about perfection, it's about restoration. A restored man doesn't deny his scars, he understands them. He knows where he's vulnerable, and he guards those places intentionally. He doesn't let the enemy use yesterday's pain to control today's choices. Unhealed wounds don't make you weak, but ignoring them makes you vulnerable. When you confront what hurt you with courage and faith, you close doors the enemy once walked through freely. The moment you stop letting old pain write new chapters, the enemy loses his grip on your future. A man doesn't walk into a fight unprepared unless he doesn't realize a fight is coming. That's the difference spiritual armor makes. It separates men who are constantly overwhelmed from men who remain steady under pressure. Spiritual armor isn't about appearing religious or using the right words. It's about being equipped to stand when pressure shows up without warning. Many men live exposed without realizing it. They face temptation, stress, and conflict with nothing guarding their thoughts, emotions, or decisions. When something hits, it hits hard. They react instead of respond. They speak before thinking. They retreat when they should stand firm. Armor doesn't eliminate battles. It keeps battles from defining you. Truth is the first layer of protection. When truth is absent, confusion takes over. A man who doesn't anchor himself in truth becomes vulnerable to every voice, every opinion, every feeling that passes through. But when truth is secured, lies lose their power. You don't panic as easily. You don't chase validation. You don't crumble when things don't go your way, because your foundation isn't shifting. Discipline is another piece many underestimate. Discipline isn't punishment, it's preparation. It's choosing consistency over comfort. A disciplined man doesn't rely on motivation because motivation fades. He relies on habits that keep him alert and grounded. When temptation appears, discipline has already done the work long before the moment arrives. Faith acts as a shield in uncertain moments. It doesn't mean the absence of doubt. It means doubt doesn't control the outcome. Faith allows a man to trust even when clarity hasn't arrived yet. Without faith, fear grows louder. With faith, fear is acknowledged but not obeyed. Prayer is often misunderstood as weakness, but it's actually awareness. Prayer keeps a man connected to something greater than his emotions. It sharpens discernment, it slows reaction. It reminds him that he's not fighting alone. A man who prays doesn't lose battles because he's constantly realigning his perspective. Spiritual armor also protects relationships. When a man is guarded inwardly, he's less reactive outwardly. He listens better, he forgives faster, he doesn't take every offense personally. Armor doesn't harden the heart, it stabilizes it. Strong men aren't those who never fall. They're those who know how to get back up without losing their identity. Armor makes recovery quicker and setbacks less damaging. It keeps one failure from becoming a pattern and one mistake from becoming a label. This kind of strength isn't built overnight. It's formed through daily choices that seem small but carry lasting impact. Every time you choose truth over comfort, discipline over impulse, faith over fear, you add another layer of protection. A man who wears his armor daily doesn't live in fear of attack, because he knows he's prepared to stand. The turning point in every battle comes when a man finally understands who he is really fighting. Until then, energy is wasted, emotions are misdirected, and relationships suffer unnecessary damage. Victory in spiritual warfare is not about avoiding conflict or pretending the struggle doesn't exist. Victory comes from clarity. Once the enemy is identified, fear begins to lose its grip, because fear thrives in confusion. So many men exhaust themselves fighting the wrong opponents. They argue harder, withdraw deeper, or try to control outcomes that were never meant to be controlled. They fight circumstances, people, and even themselves, wondering why peace always feels just out of reach. The enemy is content to let you stay busy as long as you stay blind. Activity without awareness only leads to burnout. When clarity arrives, something shifts internally. A man stops taking every challenge personally. He understands that pressure doesn't always mean failure, and resistance doesn't always mean he's on the wrong path. Sometimes resistance is confirmation that he's moving in the right direction. The enemy pushes hardest when he feels threatened. Identifying the enemy also restores authority. Authority doesn't come from volume or aggression. It comes from alignment with truth. A man who knows who he is and what he stands for doesn't panic when opposition shows up. He stands firm. He doesn't need to dominate others because he's no longer being dominated internally. This clarity transforms relationships. When you stop seeing people as the problem, compassion returns. You listen instead of defend. You seek understanding instead of victory. You protect unity instead of feeding division. The enemy loses influence when you refuse to let him turn loved ones into adversaries. It also changes how you see yourself. You stop labeling temporary struggles as permanent failures. You stop letting mistakes define your identity. You recognize that falling doesn't mean you're defeated. It means you're still in the fight. And as long as you're in the fight with awareness, defeat is never final. Victory doesn't mean the absence of battles. It means battles no longer control your direction. A mature man understands that strength isn't proven by how little he struggles, but by how wisely he navigates the struggle. He knows when to press forward and when to stand still. He knows when to speak and when to be silent. The enemy thrives on reaction, but clarity produces intention. When you move intentionally, your life stops feeling chaotic. Decisions become steadier, emotions become manageable, purpose becomes clearer, and clarity gives courage because courage grows when fear is no longer undefined. This is how men move from survival to leadership, not by overpowering every obstacle, but by understanding the nature of the fight. When a man knows the enemy, he stops fighting shadows and starts walking with confidence, knowing where to stand and how to move forward. When the enemy is exposed, confusion fades, authority returns, and victory becomes a way of life rather than a rare moment.